Okay, Jonathan, I think we're live on LinkedIn.
Yay! Congratulations. This is awesome.
Thank you for initiating this LinkedIn Live with me. This is my first time going live, and I wanted to have you join me so that we could talk about your upcoming conference, the Ending Physician Burnout Conference. So, but I want to sort of back up from there first and talk about your background because I find it fascinating. You and I just met a couple months ago, and your story fascinates me. So I wanted to start back with introducing you just as Dr. Jonathan Fischer. You are a cardiologist, and you're also a mindfulness expert. So I wanted you to share about how that came about.
Well, thanks for having me here on your first LinkedIn Live. So cool. I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn, even though I wasn't on it about a year and a half ago. Since I've been on it, it's been nothing but meeting amazing people like you. And as far as how I became a cardiologist, the short story is that my dad, who's now 95, is a physician, and he was the town doctor for a small town in New Jersey, Livingston, with about 30,000 people. And one after another, all of my 6 older brothers and sisters followed in his footsteps and became doctors. And
Wow.
so by the time it came to me, it was like, well, what else am I going to do? I thought about becoming a physicist like my mother. She was a college physics professor and a applied nuclear physicist before
Wow.
her time. Yeah.
Yes.
And so I went into medicine. And when it came to medicine, there's one aspect of the body that is very kinetic, and there's a ton of physics. So that's the heart, because we have fluid dynamics, we have electrodynamics. There's a lot going on in the heart, even though it seems like it just goes lub dub, as you can imagine. And it was a natural fit with me. And there was something that I didn't get early on about the connection between the spiritual heart and the physical heart. And I
Hmm.
was way too young in medical school when I was deciding to go into that, and a bit naive to even recognize that that's what I was getting into, that I was going to be meeting people who were often at the edge of life and death.
Hmm.
And this gets into, how did I get into mindfulness? I was a very sensitive kid, and I never heard that term used, and yet it was pretty obvious to people. I would cry. I was that guy, that sensitive boy in the corner, and very shy. And as things went by, I found myself in some pretty challenging situations in medical school and during residency and fellowship, during
Hmm.
my training. And there was a lot of posturing. Like, it's not cool to not know as much as the next person. So that
Hmm.
was a big part of it. And there was also a lot of responsibility caring for other people's lives, which
Hmm.
I didn't quite get that. And so the sensitive part of me was there. I didn't quite have the assertive part of me, and there was a huge perfectionist streak. So all of these together led me to put on this persona, like I knew exactly what I was doing at all times, when I was just pretending a lot of the time, and that was exhausting.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I did have a history of what I didn't know that's what it was called, but of anxiety. So I
Hmm.
was the guy who was always finding things to worry about, which was great as a doctor, right? You want your
Hmm.
doctor to know what to worry
True.
about, but it's not
True.
so great when you're not being treated for it, and people around you don't know that you have all these thoughts in your mind that are making life kind of miserable.
Hmm.
And so anxiety, and then depression
Mm.
came into the picture. And then there was personal loss, and loss at work, and what they call moral injury of being a doctor, which leads so many doctors to burnout.
Hmm.
Everything just came crashing down a little over a decade ago. And it really had to do with the loss of my sister, who was my best friend at the time. That was
Hmm.
Andrea.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. And she was the one who had encouraged me to get help and to be kind to myself. And she was into self-compassion before Sharon Salzberg and Kristen Neff and all these people were talking about it in public. And so Andrea, who was kind of like my spiritual guide, I didn't realize that. She just said, Johnny, just be kind to yourself. That's all you have to do.
Great advice.
Yeah. And so that started me on this path. A friend of mine who was well-meaning and wanted to help me in my darkest moment recommended a book by a Buddhist nun named um, Pema Chodron,
Hmm.
and she wrote a book called When Things Fall Apart.
Mm.
And that began a journey for me. In a parallel path, I was also doing some research on the science of living a good life. And so I had read Aristotle and the Stoics. And so then I discovered, and I was very happy to discover this whole field of positive psychology beginning in the 1940s and 50s. And Martin Seligman, the head of the American Psychological Association in 1998, declared that the whole field of psychology was going to be thrown out the window, this Freudian notion that we're all broken and defective. And instead, we're going to study what it means to live a good and happy and fulfilled life. And so there were these two parallel paths pushing me in the same direction, place of deep pain. On the spiritual side, I was discovering meditation. And on the positive psychology side, there was a lot of evidence and writing then about the power of mindfulness and other forms of meditation in becoming more self-aware and allowing you to live a good life. So that's the short answer of why mindfulness and why cardiology.
And what about during that time? So 10 years ago, you were busy practicing. You had a cardiology practice at that time. So what did that look like for you to try to integrate mindfulness into a super busy schedule?
Yeah, so it's still a challenge because 90% of my life in the last few years has been cardiology. 10%, now 40% of my time, I've been invited to work at an organizational system-wide level for a team of 30,000, trying to make things better for the people doing the healing and the caring. The challenge is that, in our society, we're so rushed and frenzied as it is. Now, on top of that, factor in there's an emergency going on down the hall, please come running, kind of a thing. It's not very conducive to sitting quietly and zen on a pillow for half an hour. Not at all. And so I had to become creative in finding ways to introduce mindfulness. And what I discovered, which is John Kabat-Zinn, who writes so beautifully about this in all of his books, that there's really two forms of meditative practice. There's what's called the formal, and all of this, but for people who are listening, there's what's called the formal practice of meditation, which literally means, this is what you think of when you see someone sitting on a cushion or doing yoga. You're taking some form. Your body is in some form, lying down, walking, sitting, standing. Those are the forms. Doing that for a longer period of time trains the mind to become more aware and less distracted. And then once you have that skill, you can then apply it in what's called informal practice, which is really the point of it all. The point of it all is not to become a good meditator. The point is to deal with the stresses of daily life and come out in a way where you're bringing love and you're bringing kindness instead of stress and havoc. So I do both. So I have like a formal practice where 5 minutes in the car, 10 minutes after work in the car, just sitting quietly. And then my informal practice begins when I wake up in the morning. I've got 2 minutes where I just, instead of racing with thoughts, I check in with my breath, start to tap into what my body's feeling like, head to toe, start to ask myself what's most important for me, what values do I want to bring with me into the day? And they're usually the same: curiosity, kindness, openness, calm. These are the kinds of values. And just by setting that quick intention in the morning, my prefrontal cortex, that executive center part of my brain, has the game plan, so that when things get stressful, there's that little glimmer of memory that's like, oh, this is what's important to you. And so that's part of my practice. And then I have a doorknob practice. So if I'm about to enter a patient's room or a colleague's room, I knock on the door and I try and use that as an alarm bell to wake up my mind and say, it's time to wake up again. You've been on autopilot. Time to wake up. How do you see this next meeting or conference going? What would you like to experience? What would you like others to experience of you? And that's a question that I ask as well. And then I do a similar practice at night or during the day, a little gratitude here and there sprinkled in. It's not strictly mindfulness, and yet it's a vital part of living a balanced and good life.
I love that you found, first of all, I'm a big believer also in the morning ritual and starting your day with that intention. Even if it just is 90 seconds, it makes all the difference in starting your day. And I really admire that you still have several check-ins during the day so that you're checking in with your mind and your body, and then you're adjusting accordingly. And the doorknob is a great advice for others who might be listening to think about, like, when they're opening their car door. Maybe that's your little red flag reminder to reconnect to yourself and just even take one deep breath or something like that. So I mean, I feel like if you can fit mindfulness into your schedule, and also, don't you think it really, or has it helped you make those split decisions, which in your career are life and death decisions? So I think really being so intuitive and so connected to yourself in that kind of field probably makes you next level as far as being a great caregiver.
There's that element. I mean, with mindfulness, there's a couple different elements. On the one hand, there's the spiritual side, which we were alluding to a little bit, which is, we all experience suffering in our lives, and there's something about this practice, and we could talk about this maybe on another LinkedIn Live about that leads to a sense of fulfillment. And I don't mean spiritual in the sense of religion. I just mean getting outside of our own heads and really serving other people without always thinking about me, my. That's the power of mindfulness for me, is sort of noticing that chattering part of the brain that's always telling stories about how the world is threatening to me, and instead turning it outward. What you were just speaking about was there's now tons of research that shows that people who have the trait of mindfulness, so the ability to become aware and non-judgmental of moment-to-moment experience, and also the skill of mindfulness, which you can develop over time, have a less tendency towards making errors, less tendency towards distraction in those critical moments, which is why top athletes, Olympic athletes, top musicians, and now I'm hoping, and also we see it in law enforcement, in the military, in the Marine Corps, all using mindfulness. I'm hoping that we can see this more and more in our healthcare field, not as like a feel-good exercise, but really as a public safety issue where we can train our mind to be fully focused.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, share with us, because I was quite surprised to hear about the sort of state of unwellness in the medical space and with physicians and burnout. So will you share what you're seeing? And as you mentioned, you lead 30,000 caregivers, so you have a good sense of what's happening with your colleagues.
Yeah, I'm so lucky. I work on a team with one of the very first chief well-being officers in the country. His name is Dr. Tom Janicki, and he helped me through my own burnout about 5 years ago. He is one of the most mindful, focused, compassionate, positive people I know. And he struggled himself with burnout about a decade ago. And what helped him was coaching. And so he developed a radically new program and introduced it to our own healthcare system, Novant Health, where every single doctor in the institution is offered a holistic coaching program where you look at your future goals, your past, your conditioned behaviors, even going back to your childhood, and trying to get a sense of what's most important to you. And so I've been fortunate to go through that there. In terms of what's going on in healthcare today, since the 1980s or so, there's been a low-level conversation about burnout. Really only in the last 5 to 6 years has it come to the forefront. In fact, the first major mention of it in a medical journal was around 2017 in the New England Journal of Medicine, where Victor Zhao, who was was president of the National Academy of Medicine, among other things, wrote a paper, an article called "The Crisis of Burnout." And so even though Christina Maslach has done the research, and a guy named Freudenberger had done the first research and mention of burnout in the 1970s in New York, it's taken 30, 40 years now that we're seeing that it seems to be like everyone's talking about it. In terms of healthcare, the rates, well, first we should back up and just say, what the heck is burnout? Does it just mean that I'm stressed out? Because some people use it to mean I'm just feeling stressed. And the answer is that it's absolutely not the same as feeling stressed or anxious or even tired. It's a constellation. It's a clinical diagnosis. Now, the World Health Organization recognizes this as a public health issue. 2019, they defined it as such. And so it really is, it's got 3 core elements. One is feeling a sense of ineffectiveness. Everything you've trained to do, everything's getting in your way. You're just sort of tripping over obstacles after obstacles. The second is a feeling of cynicism. You don't even feel connected with your purpose anymore. You don't even treat other people like a human being. And I saw this myself. I went into medicine because I wanted to be like my dad, like treating one person at a time, showing them compassion. And I really, after a decade through medical school residency, I had all that stripped out of me. It's just
Mm,
part of the culture. You become more like a machine, like a robot. And so I would go through my days, and I'm ashamed to say it. I
mm,
would see patients and I would just be like, how quickly can I get on to the next person? That's horrible. I'm not proud of that. And that's not why I wanted to become a doctor. And yet, because of a complicated mix of factors, both external factors relating to the third parties that are involved in your healthcare,
mhm,
organizational practices. I'll just say it, bad leadership in many situations where the leaders have no idea what it's like to do the work. And then
mhm,
a lot of internal factors. I had a history of anxiety and depression that was barely being treated. And so it's this perfect storm of external and internal factors that lead the individual, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, towards this sense that you just can't take it anymore. So the second part of burnout is that cynicism, that depersonalization. And the
mhm.
third is the easiest to recognize. You're just exhausted all the time, physically, emotionally, spiritually. You've got nothing left in the tank. So that was me for about a decade.
Mm,
Turns out, turns out that the research shows that if you poll, and I'm now friends with the head of Medscape, the chief medical officer of Medscape. They polled 29 medical subspecialties, and they do that every year, talking about, how burned out are you? What brings you joy in your life? It's around 50%, 50 of all doctors, 1 out of 2, is burned out to one degree or another. And what I find even more painful to look at, and this is very recent,
mm,
is the rate of depression. And I've been trying to make it clear that burnout is often just a proxy. It's just an easy way to talk about deep pain that people are feeling without using the actual word, which is often depression.
mm,
And the rates of depression among doctors is significantly higher than the general population, as is the rate of suicide among doctors. And the rate of depression overlapping with burnout was around 10 to 15% a few years ago. Now it's close to 20%. So about 1 out of every 5 doctors is clinically depressed. Now imagine that's your doctor. You're about to go into
yeah.
their office. What is that going to do to impact their care? We have a lot of work to do to help improve the mental health, the psychological safety, and total well-being of our doctors. And when I say doctors, it's not about doctors. It's about nurses. It's about
Mhm.
pharmacists. It's about what's called APPs, medical students, residents.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Those numbers are heart wrenching and staggering. And why do you think that that hasn't been addressed? Like in med school, they don't teach mindfulness 101 or.
Well, the good news is the first medical school at the University of Massachusetts, which was where John Kabat-Zinn, who was brought mindfulness practice from Southeast Asia and from his trips in the late 60s and 70s into the West. So he started it. And just a few years ago, that's the first medical school where it's sort of part of the curriculum.
Wonderful.
And now there are more. Mindfulness does have a role in over 700 healthcare systems around the world right now. Now, some of that just could be like one 30-minute talk. Others can be what I'm trying to bring is real, workshops. We've got training for doctors, for patients. And the question you asked was why? Why is it taking so long to bring attention to this? And it's because culture is something that's hard to touch and it's hard to change.
Hmm.
And there's an overlap between the culture of healthcare and the culture of modern capitalism
Yeah.
and industrial society. And it's that sort of merger there where healthcare sort of fell along the lines of the bottom line being the dollar rather than the bottom line being the total health, physical and spiritual well-being of all the people that it touches. That's where things got off track. And as you know, there's this thing called cognitive dissonance where, once you've been doing something for so long and you grew up in the field of healthcare and now you're a leader in the field, if you have never known another way, you just don't even want to look at another way.
Hmm.
Because part of that may be admitting we've done things wrong for a while. And that's
Hmm.
hard to do for any of us.
Hmm. Well, you've admitted that for a lot of people, which leads us to talking about your upcoming Ending Physician Burnout Conference. So, how did you decide to do it? And now, I mean, Ariana Huffington is keynoting, and you have so many other people involved in the conference. Talk about how you went from idea to what looks like a very big production that
Mm.
I hope will be the first of many of your conferences with
Mm.
to help the caregivers.
So The idea started before I was even aware of it. And that was a few years ago when I made a shift from myself, from being somebody who was a victim of a system to somebody who was no longer going to be a victim. And it really happened in the middle of the night when I was in the hospital on call and I was getting paged back to the emergency room. And I was thinking, not again. You know, my wife and kids are at home. I miss them every fourth night or so. I'm miserable. And I
Mhm.
imagined that the whole system, healthcare system, was like crashing down over me. And
Mhm.
that's just how it felt for years and years. My whole nervous system was just a mess. I was all revved up, stressed out most of the time, and trying to hide it.
Mhm.
And I just I took a moment. I was like, well, what if instead of viewing it like I'm being drowned by the system, what if I view how privileged I am to get a very unique view of what healthcare is really like, being up in
Mhm.
the middle of the night during emergencies, and instead of being underneath the wave, what if I pretend that I'm surfing on top of the wave and I'm looking, and I can start to tell people who are around me what it really looks like?
Mhm.
And that was a shift a few years ago. And then, in terms of practically speaking, I part of my own healing was to be on social media, which I was. There's doctors have a lot of reasons to avoid social media. There's a lot of liability. What are people going to think about
True.
you? And there takes some courage to be vulnerable and open about your stories because
Mhm.
it becomes part of the record. So an amazing person, Kelsey Trefethen in California, wrote me a little message a year and a half ago and said, "I love your stories. I love the truth you're telling. I'm writing a dissertation on healthcare provider burnout. Do you want to maybe create a community or a summit?" So
Wow.
that was the idea. And in terms of um, how did we get 55 speakers from around the world, many, many countries represented, and Ariana Huffington and everyone to join in? I think at its core, it's because we're telling a story that is true.
Mhm.
And we're telling a story that involves suffering that's unnecessary. And we're offering solutions and a vision that is potentially going to improve the care of patients, quote unquote, which I mean human beings around the world. I think healers for too long have had their potential stifled,
Mhm.
not only to do what they're passionate about, but to have a career that feels like there's a trajectory and growth there. And because of that, we haven't been giving the best possible care. And I think there's a better way. And then the summit itself, from me, comes from a place of humility because I'm not the one with the answers. I have the easy part. I just kind of invite other people to help. And I have the humility to say, I need help. And
Mhm.
we, 950,000 doctors in the United States, half of them are burned out, 20% are depressed. We need help. And I just know that finding people outside of medicine and inside of medicine, looking for best practices. So I have somebody who does mental health and coaching for the New York Knicks because I
Wow.
believe that people in healthcare should be treated like athletes. I asked Ariana Huffington and Thrive Global because who does sleep and total well-being better? And so I figured, why not ask if she would lend her voice to this, and she was happy to.
Mhm.
And so it was kind of like that. And Dr. Jim Doty is a hero of mine and a mentor. He wrote a book called Into the Magic Shop, which is about how a neurosurgeon at Stanford incorporated mindfulness and compassion practice. And he inspired me to bring that to help lead a research trial at my own institution to teach the surgeons to meditate before every surgery and what happens if they bring compassion. So one after another, I could name 55 of these global keynote speakers, many of whom have been on TED stages, have all said, where can I sign up? How can I help? We need to change.
I'm so glad. And also now meditation, mindfulness, even breath, there's up to the minute fascinating science and neuroscience behind it. So I imagine that if some of the doctors maybe didn't feel the way you did about mindfulness or the softer side of meditation, maybe now with all of the science backed data, it might be easier to get some of those people that say, I'm not really into the mindfulness. Or like, was there any feedback from physicians, or did you have to try to convince them to come to the conference? What's that been like?
So there's two separate issues there. One is about the conference itself, which is about burnout, but really it's not about burnout. It's about how can we make psychologically safe, supportive, and nurturing healthcare environments where all team members live their best lives. So it's not. I use the word burnout so people know what the heck we're talking about, but it's not. We're not going to be dwelling on that. As far as the mindfulness, I like to be extremely careful that, first of all, this is not a summit about mindfulness. This mindfulness is one very small tool, and I hate to call it that, but in some ways it is a tool.
Hmm.
There's a lot of negative feeling about mindfulness. So if I
Yeah.
was to talk to a group of doctors and say, we're going to talk about mindfulness, you know what I find? It's
Yes.
tomatoes in my face,
Yes.
because that suggests that if we could just be more aware as individuals, the system won't bring us down. And what I'm interested now is shifting the conversation towards something called organizational mindfulness, which
Hmm.
no longer puts the burden of self-awareness onto one individual person, because people don't burn out because there's something wrong with them or they lack resiliency. People burn out because, to be fair, I think healthcare systems, like other organizations, are still just learning how to do it right. That's why we
Hmm.
have a whole field of organizational psychology. But to answer your question, we're going to be asking exactly those questions. And one of the keynote, well, it's a fireside chat. I get to talk with Dr. Omar Dawood, who's the chief medical officer of the billion-dollar Calm app. So we're going to be talking for an hour about all of those things, Sandy, including we're going to kind of geek out about the science of meditation and mindfulness.
Awesome. And what feedback have you gotten from people that were close to you as you sort of began to bring mindfulness and bring more calm and start to, take care of yourself better and be kinder to yourself? Um, like, how did you change energetically? Like, were people noticing the difference?
Yeah, I mean, you could ask any of the 35 people who work in my office. If you asked them 7 or 8 years ago what it was like, they'd say that I was a jerk. I mean, I would come to work. I would barely say hi to people. I would kind of like look down. I'd be thinking, how can I get through this hour and this hour and this hour? And again, I hate to say this, I was kind of using people like to help me get through my day, which is the opposite of what I want to be doing. Long story short, my partner saw me that way. Other people saw me that way, kind of cold, aloof, which is not who I want to be. And now, I guess before COVID, like I can't go down my hallway without everybody, hey, Dr. Fischer, can I have a hug? High five everywhere. I have smiles and laughter. I mean, you'd say, you're laughing in a heart doctor's office? Absolutely. I find opportunities for joy, laughter, love. I literally try to use love as a medicine with every single patient. And they may not know that, and yet I am trying to bring compassion within myself and to bring it into the space with them. And I think the science shows, and we could talk another time about that, about how compassion itself literally can heal the body and heal the mind. So the reaction has been pretty dramatic with my staff. And
Mhm.
then my best friend at work, Dr. Harris, he'll tell you that when he first met me, he saw this trajectory towards more and more calm. And now he's like, you changed my life, because he's practicing meditation and mindfulness and breath work. And I think, Sandy, it works like that, right? People see the change in you and they're like, okay, where can I get some of that?
Exactly. It's the energy is contagious. And
Yeah.
the same thing, the saying goes, that's like, with negative energy, it's contagious as well. So you have to elevate it. And you obviously did that around your colleagues, and everybody rose to the occasion because people are more, want to be around that versus that. And I can't imagine the other Jonathan,
It's true.
because it's so nice to have met you on the other side.
Yes. And I appreciate that, Sandy. And I don't think I would have met you if I was the other version of myself, not towards the better version of myself. And the reason for the summit is because so many doctors and nurses are not in that thriving, loving place that they were born into, and maybe they had childhoods into, some of them. Um,
Mhm.
Often there's this gradual stripping away of this natural empathy that we have and this natural kind spirit, even on the administrator side sometimes. And so, what I'm hoping is we can bring just a good bit of compassion and a good bit of empathy and a heck of a lot of self awareness as we work together to do some real. I mean, I have two attorneys who are speaking to do some real discussions about policy work. We're going to be talking about racial inequity in healthcare, gender inequity, bias. So we're going to be tackling some pretty hard conversations, and we've got some basic guiding principles around compassion for ourselves, empathy and compassion for others, and just pausing and slowing down for some self-awareness as we try to heal the heart of our healthcare system.
Yeah, it's going to be tremendous. Also, we met through Dr. Darren Davidson, and I just was reminded about him when you were mentioning about physicians and talking about athletes, because he also suffered from some physician burnout, but he now coaches on sort of that, like the high performance mindset for physicians now. And I know he's going to be talking about that at the conference as well. But I think that that is really important for not the focus, not necessarily to be on the burnout part, but what happens after the burnout. And you embody that and are a great example, as is Dr. Darren Davidson. And so I'm excited also because I feel like, completely outside of the medical industry, all of these conversations are beneficial for me as an entrepreneur or a wellness professional or anything. And so I also, on that note, have a few tickets to the conference that if anybody is watching this on LinkedIn and wants to attend, they can message me. I think I have 3 tickets that available to give away. Do you recommend that people be physicians or caregivers to attend this, or what?
Yeah, not necessarily. My secret wish is that healthcare as a system and as providers can take on the responsibility that I think we've lost, which is why there's $1 billion kind of figuring out wellness outside of science, outside of healthcare. I'd like to be a better example. And so this conference itself is primarily for any person who considers themselves a healer or a caregiver, who's experienced that feeling of giving so much and so much you've got nothing left. And that can lead to burnout. Some people call it compassion fatigue, and we're going to be talking about that. So anybody in that space who's really, some of it is specific to healthcare and some of it is not. It's meant mostly for healthcare providers, clinicians, students, and healthcare leaders. And then coaches, people who want to be in that space of helping people in healthcare to kind of get things back on the right track. We've got sessions on coaching as well.
I hope med students come. I think it's really important to start integrating this into at the student level. That would be note to self, because my niece is in med school. I'm gonna talk to her.
Please tell her. So my number one audience, you just said it. This conference, all of this, thousands of hours that I've spent nights and weekends as a labor of love, because this is not to make profit here. This is going to create more and more programs. The reason for this is because I wish I had this when I was a medical student. My whole life would have been changed if I had 3 days straight of 55 sessions talking about every aspect of the career that lay ahead of me and how to avoid the landmines. And so we've got friends who are in Southeast Asia right now who are writing letters to the directors of every medical school. We're talking about, Burma, Vietnam. I mean, we're really reaching out. We've got National Health Service in England. We're reaching out to medical program directors across America as well. So please spread the word. If you know anyone in healthcare or who's a leader or trains other people, tell them about this conference. Tell them that if anybody can't afford it, it's free. I mean, the people who are paying money are those well-being champions that maybe have the resources, that are going to be getting a year's worth of medical education credits, which is incredibly valuable. So mostly, but those who can't, it's either $50 for students or it's entirely free if a student feels like that's too much of a burden.
Fantastic. I hope that we can share this on LinkedIn so that people can let others know. And one last question is sort of after the conference, what are you looking to see? Like, what will make you feel like this was a success? And what outside of the conference in the medical industry, maybe like 3 to 5 years down the road, what do you want to see?
Such a great question. So I already view this conference as a success. At first I was thinking, what needs to happen? How many people have to come? And I was like, that's not the positive psychology side of me. That side of me says that in order for me to do this, I have to view every day as a success. Every day that one more person is talking about the facts on the ground and how hard it is right now, and working together to find solutions, new collaborations. So Sandy, if you meet one of the other 55 speakers around the world and think, oh my gosh, I'm going to work with this person to bring breath work, mindfulness into a healthcare system, that's successful. If one medical student or resident or doctor is considering suicide and they just say, gosh, there's reason for hope here, There's people working on this. If one person finds a way out of that, that's a success for me. So it doesn't have to be tens of thousands. That's really all. And I can tell you that I've already experienced that. People are writing me messages and saying, this is incredible. I just thank you. And so that's my purpose. That's what gives me drive. And to answer your question, if we start to see conversations in our healthcare systems really honest and not feeling ashamed to say, we've made some mistakes. The physicians, we haven't done right by all of our physicians. They've been putting up with too much for too long. And it really affects our bottom line, but it also, there's a reason beyond the dollar to take this seriously, to put money and time into asking at every healthcare institution, how can we make our doctors, our nurses, our pharmacists healthier? How can we get them the sleep that they need? How can they get them the emotional support they need? How can we bring back a sense of camaraderie, a joie de vivre, so that it isn't just a drudgery? If I hear that conversation at 1, 2, or even 10 healthcare institutions around the world, success.
You will. You embody this whole thing so beautifully, and that the fact that you've found the time outside of your busy practice and the time for your family that I know is so important to you to make this happen. I deeply admire your work, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful that you opened my eyes. I really had no idea that it was such a dire, tragic, urgent situation with caregivers. I mean, of course, COVID shed a light on that as well. So I did volunteer a lot of my time to do breath workshops for first responders or nurses or doctors, but I didn't realize that it was, a long time in the making. And to see you share your personal experience and to get to know you a little bit, I know that this is really going to make a big difference, because having someone like you at the forefront and as a visionary and doing this, it's going to lift and elevate the community and the conversation. And so thank you for all this amazing work. And thank you for taking the time to share it with everyone. And I look forward to the conference, which begins August 24th, right?
It does. And meeting you and getting to present with you at the Canadian Orthopedics Association conference was incredible. And I'm looking forward to more work. And I have to say, the work that you're doing with the Global Wellness Institute on breathwork around the world is absolutely amazing. So I'm totally inspired by you in exactly the same way. I want you to know that.
Thank you.
Of course. And yes, the conference is in 11 short days. And if anyone is interested, it's easy to remember where to go. endingphysicianburnout.com. It's right there. And we have a group on LinkedIn and Instagram and Clubhouse. We have over 5,000 members in our community of healthcare leaders and providers, and it's growing every day.
Amazing. And it's under that same thing.
If you Google Ending Physician Burnout, you should find us, or just go to endingphysicianburnout.com and you can register today.
Terrific. Well, we'll have to do another LinkedIn Live after the conference and just talk about what happened.
I think my wife says I'm going to take a month off of social media.
This is true. We'll schedule it for later in the fall.
October.
October it is. In the meantime, rest up, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take good care.
You too, Sandy. This has been great. Thanks so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.